During World War II, patchwork quilting became much more than just a hobby. For millions of women, it became a survival skill. Fabric shortages were everywhere, clothing was rationed, new blankets were expensive, and in many homes, absolutely nothing could be wasted. Tiny scraps from old shirts, worn-out dresses, military uniforms, and even flour sacks were carefully saved for future quilts. What makes these WW2 patchwork patterns special is that they carried emotions. They represented sacrifice, hope, grief, and family memories stitched together by hand. Today, many of these incredible patchwork designs have completely disappeared. Modern sewing became faster, simpler, and machine-perfect. The old methods slowly faded away, so today, we're diving into forgotten WW2 patchwork patterns our grandmothers stitched during one of the hardest periods in history. One of the most iconic wartime patchwork designs was called the Depression Star. At first glance, it looked simple, with giant stars across the blanket. During WW2, fabric rationing was strict. Women collected the tiniest scraps possible in jars and tins, some saved for months just to complete a single star. Every star was unique, made from faded aprons, children's clothing, and sometimes even military uniforms from loved ones serving overseas. Many grandmothers stitched these late at night by candlelight. Imagine the patience required to hand-cut hundreds of perfect diamonds without modern tools. Authentic WW2 Depression Star quilts are historical treasures, representing resilience during one of the darkest periods in modern history. Next is the feed sack flour quilt. During the war, companies packed flour, sugar, and grain inside large cotton sacks. Manufacturers started printing floral patterns and colorful designs directly onto the sacks. Women even traded sacks with neighbors to collect matching colors. From this trend came the feed sack flour quilt. Grandmothers washed the sacks to remove logos before cutting them into flower-shaped pieces. The finished quilts looked like giant flower gardens, bright reds, faded blues, and sunflower yellows. Every quilt carried a handmade charm. During World War II, the letter V became a symbol of victory and hope. Many women stitched it directly into their quilts. Women often gathered in community halls to sew these Victory V quilts while discussing war news from the radio. Certain victory quilts contained coded meanings. Dark fabrics represented uncertainty, while brighter sections symbolized hope for peace. One of the most symbolic designs was the broken dishes pattern. The name alone represented the hardship of the era. Most broken dishes quilts were stitched using leftover scraps too small for other projects. Nothing was wasted. Each tiny broken piece carried memories. But after the war, quilting trends changed, and younger generations no longer had the patience for such work. The pinecone patchwork quilt was famous for its heavy, three-dimensional appearance. It used folded fabric pieces layered carefully in circular patterns. Each folded piece had to be stitched individually by hand. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of tiny scraps were required for a single quilt. Authentic wartime pinecone quilts are rare today because very few people still know how to make them correctly. Finally, the scrap path quilt. This design looked messy and unpredictable with long winding rows of mismatched fabric pieces. The scrap path quilt symbolized uncertain journeys. Every scrap represented a different part of family life stitched into one shared story. These quilts capture the emotional reality of wartime life better than any photograph ever could. They are the stitches of our history. World War II changed almost every part of daily life. Food became limited, families were separated, entire cities lived in fear of air raids and uncertain futures. But inside small homes, women continued stitching quilts by hand, not because it was easy, but because quilts became symbols of comfort during chaos. Every leftover fabric scrap mattered. Every pattern carried emotion. Many wartime quilts reflected exactly what people were seeing, hearing, and feeling during those terrifying years. Some patterns were patriotic, some represented fear and uncertainty, and others quietly captured the emotional loneliness of war itself. Today, most younger generations have never even heard the names of these patchwork designs. Let's explore the forgotten patterns our grandmothers stitched. One of the most haunting forgotten patchwork designs was the blackout window quilt. To understand it, you must understand the fear of nighttime. Families had to cover windows so enemy aircraft could not spot lights from above. Homes became silent. Neighborhoods disappeared into shadows. The blackout window quilt used dark fabric squares arranged beside tiny lighter patches that looked like faint glowing windows hidden inside darkness. Women often stitched tiny white or yellow squares into the design to represent small bits of hidden candlelight escaping through covered windows. Because fabric was rationed, many quilts included pieces cut from old blackout curtains. Fabric used to hide from enemy aircraft became family blankets. The pattern slowly disappeared after the war. People wanted brighter, happier designs, not reminders of fear and darkness stitched across their beds. The flying geese pattern gained a new meaning. Traditionally it symbolized journeys, but during wartime people associated it with military aircraft. Mothers stitched flying geese quilts while sons trained for war. The repeating triangles looked like endless formations of airplanes disappearing into clouds. Some women changed colors to military greens and navy blues, inspired by uniforms. These quilts often carried emotional imperfections from stressful times. In some families, flying geese quilts were goodbye gifts. Mothers stitched prayers directly into the fabric through hours of hand sewing. The rail fence quilt looked simple, but during the war, it became connected to movement, separation, and change. Railroads were everywhere. Soldiers traveled by train. Families said emotional goodbyes at crowded stations filled with uniforms and tears. Women stitched long fabric strips using scraps from old clothing. Some used darker strips beside lighter ones to create the illusion of endless tracks. Historians found women exchanged fabric strips through mail. A single quilt could contain pieces from multiple households separated by war. One of the most fascinating patterns was the compass point quilt, featuring giant starburst shapes spreading outward in sharp triangular points. The compass point quilt symbolized guidance and the hope that loved ones would someday find their way home again. The pattern was extremely difficult. Grandmothers measured every piece by hand using cardboard templates and scissors worn down from years of use. Women mixed completely different materials, cotton beside wool, faded floral fabric beside military green cloth. This gave every quilt a rough beauty. The soldier's square quilt focused on memory. Women used pieces cut from military uniforms and old fatigues belonging to loved ones overseas. Some quilts included handwritten embroidery, initials, military dates, or short phrases sewn carefully into the corners. In many ways, these quilts became family memory archives. Children who slept under them grew up hearing stories connected to every square. Out of all designs, the shadow box quilt may have been the eeriest. Dark borders around lighter squares created a three-dimensional optical illusion. The contrast between darkness and brightness unintentionally mirrored wartime emotions, fear surrounding tiny moments of hope. World War II affected people in ways modern generations can barely imagine. Families waited months for letters. Radios became the center of every home. Fear, hope, loneliness, and uncertainty existed together every single day, and somehow women stitched all of those emotions directly into quilts. These patchwork patterns were not just decorative designs. They reflected wartime psychology itself. Every triangle, square, and stitched line carried hidden meanings connected to survival, separation, patriotism, or memory. Today, most people see old quilts as simple blankets, but during WW2 they were emotional histories sewn by hand, and some of the forgotten patterns we're about to discuss reveal just how deeply war shaped ordinary family life. The radio wave quilt. During WW2, radios became one of the most important objects inside every home. Families gathered around them every night, listening to war updates, casualty reports, and emergency broadcasts. For many people, the radio was their only connection to the outside world. And slowly, that influence appeared in quilting. The radio wave quilt featured repeating zigzag lines stretching across the fabric like invisible signals moving through the air. Some designs looked almost like sound waves or electrical pulses frozen into cloth. Women associated these with the constant flow of wartime news. Some families remembered sitting silently around radios while mothers stitched these quilts in the background. The sound of sewing needles moving through fabric mixed with crackling radio broadcasts became part of everyday wartime life. Emotionally, these quilts carried tension. Every radio announcement could change someone's life forever. Some women reportedly stitched faster during stressful broadcasts. Uneven stitches and tighter seams sometimes reflected emotional anxiety hidden inside. Because fabric shortages continued, women used any material: old dresses, faded shirts, feed sacks, curtains, and work uniforms. This created strange combinations of colors and textures that made each radio wave quilt unique. The zigzag design required careful alignment. After the war, radios became associated with entertainment again. The emotional connection behind the pattern faded, and fewer women continued making it. Today, authentic radio wave quilts are extremely rare because many people simply forgot the symbolic meaning they once carried. The metal ribbon patchwork. This pattern was inspired by military medals and service ribbons awarded to soldiers during WW2. Women recreated those ribbon-like stripes using long rectangular fabric pieces arranged in layered rows across the blanket. For families with loved ones serving overseas, these quilts became deeply personal. Mothers stitched them while waiting for letters from sons. Wives made them for husbands returning home. Some women even added embroidered stars to honor relatives in different branches of the military, and tragically, in some homes, the quilts later became memorial pieces after soldiers never returned. Metal ribbon designs often used darker color combinations: deep reds, navy blues, and olive greens inspired by uniforms. Interestingly, quilting groups organized community projects where multiple women worked together on quilts for military hospitals. Injured soldiers recovering from war sometimes received these handmade blankets as comfort items. That connection made them incredibly meaningful. The ration book quilt may have represented wartime daily life more accurately than any other design. Life became organized around coupons. The ration book quilt used repeating rectangular sections arranged in strict grid patterns that resembled pages of coupons. Women had to carefully plan every purchase. Fabric could not be wasted. Even tiny scraps became valuable resources. Grandmothers reused materials modern people would throw away. Some saved fabric trimmings no larger than a finger to complete sections. The quilting process mirrored rationing discipline: careful measurements, precise cuts, and maximum efficiency with minimal waste. Despite their simplicity, these quilts became symbols of resilience. They reminded families that survival depended on patience and creativity. During World War II, millions of women carried emotional burdens silently. Some patterns became symbols of hope, others reflected fear. The farewell letter quilt. This quilt looked soft, delicate, and deeply personal. The pattern used rectangular sections like folded envelopes. For many families, handwritten mail became the only connection between soldiers and home. Every envelope carried hope, fear, or heartbreak. Some mothers embroidered small handwritten phrases directly into the fabric. Others stitched initials, dates, or military numbers. The design often used soft cream fabrics and muted floral scraps. Behind that softness was constant anxiety for letters that never arrived. The factory line patchwork. During WW2, millions of women entered factories. They built aircraft, packed ammunition, and repaired machinery. The factory line patchwork used long straight strips and repeating square sections. This design looked industrial, sharp, and structured. Women who once spent time at home now balanced factory work with cooking, childcare, and sewing late at night because time was limited. Many women preferred patterns with straight strips that could be assembled faster than complicated stars. The map route quilt was one of the most emotionally symbolic. The pattern used winding strips arranged like military routes crossing a map. Families constantly followed news about troop movements. Newspapers printed maps showing military progress across Europe and the Pacific. Women stitched twisting pathways representing journeys, separations, and the uncertain movement of loved ones far away. Every family wanted the same thing for loved ones to somehow find their way back home safely. The pattern gradually disappeared after the war. Today, these quilts are fascinating because they transformed wartime geography into personal art. Today, these patchwork styles are almost forgotten, but hidden inside every stitch. There was a story. By the middle of World War II, life no longer felt normal for most families. Air raid sirens, military propaganda, rationing, and blackouts became routine. Even children grew up understanding words like evacuation, shortages, and casualty reports. And through all of this, quilts continued to be stitched by hand. Earlier quilt styles focused on flowers and stars, but wartime quilts became darker, sharper, and more symbolic. Fear and survival quietly entered the stitching itself. One of the most intense patterns was the air raid siren quilt. It was inspired by the terrifying scream of sirens echoing through cities at night. The air raid siren quilt used sharp zigzag lines and expanding circular shapes that visually resembled sound waves or alarm vibrations spreading outward. Women often stitched these quilts while listening nervously to real sirens. The repetitive movement of stitching gave people something to focus on during uncertainty. During World War II, camouflage became a recognizable symbol. Military uniforms and equipment used special patterns to blend in. Eventually, quilting adopted the idea to the camouflage patchwork quilt used irregular fabric pieces in chaotic combinations. Some even included actual pieces of damaged military clothing stitched directly into the blanket. Not every wartime quilt reflected fear. One of the most beautiful forgotten patterns was the Victory Garden quilt, representing hope and resilience through community effort. These featured rows of fabric, flowers, and vegetable-inspired blocks. Some grandmothers even embroidered tiny vegetables directly into the quilt corners. As the war continued, emotions became heavier. Train stations became places of painful goodbyes. These memories found their way into the station platform quilt. The design used long horizontal strips intersected by square blocks, resembling railway tracks and train windows viewed from above, symbolizing movement and separation. The newspaper block quilt used rectangular sections arranged like printed pages. Because batting was scarce, many women stuffed quilts with folded newspaper sheets for warmth. Historians have occasionally discovered preserved wartime headlines trapped between layers. Imagine sleeping under a blanket containing real news of the battles happening then. Finally, the ghost window quilt created a strange optical illusion at night. Pale square shapes surrounded by dark borders looked like glowing windows in darkness. These windows represented homes waiting through the darkness, tiny lights surviving inside uncertain times. They captured how wartime darkness affected people emotionally. Today, these patterns have mostly vanished. They remain a silent record of history, preserving the forgotten stories of survival stitched into every patchwork seam. By the later years of World War II, people had learned how to survive with almost nothing. Families repaired old shoes repeatedly. Clothes were patched again and again until barely usable. Kitchens stretched tiny amounts of food into full meals. And women became masters of saving every scrap of fabric possible. Nothing was wasted. Because quilts were made from those scraps, they slowly became records of wartime survival itself. Some reflected daily household struggles, some captured hidden emotional pain, and others quietly preserved pieces of family history that otherwise would have disappeared forever. Today, most people have never even heard the names of these forgotten patchwork styles. But during WW2, they meant everything. One of the warmest and most comforting wartime patchwork patterns was the kitchen shelf quilt. It reflected ordinary home life. The pattern used rows of blocks arranged like shelves stacked with jars and pantry items. Some added embroidered details like jam jars. During wartime shortages, kitchens became places of creativity and sacrifice. Sugar, butter, meat, and canned goods were rationed carefully. Women often stitched kitchen shelf quilts while cooking. Many included scraps from aprons, dish towels, and flour sacks. For children growing up during the war, these quilts later became reminders of warmth and family safety during uncertain times. During World War II, letters were precious. Families saved those envelopes because they were proof that loved ones were still alive. Eventually, those stamps inspired quilting patterns. The stamp collection quilt featured dozens of small blocks arranged like postage stamps. Each block contained different fabric patterns, floral prints beside stripes, and faded military fabric beside bright household scraps. For wartime families, letters became the only emotional lifeline. Mothers waited desperately for deliveries, and wives reread old letters repeatedly. Some historians believe certain quilts included hidden fabric pockets where special letters were stored temporarily inside the quilt itself. Out of all forgotten WW2 patterns, the last fabric quilt may have carried the strongest message about survival, created out of desperation. Many families had almost no fabric left. Women collected every final usable scrap remaining inside the home. Tiny corners from ripped dresses, sleeves from old shirts, frayed apron pieces. Nothing was too small for the last fabric quilt. It looked chaotic with uneven shapes and mismatched textures, but emotionally, that randomness told a powerful story of endurance. By the final years of World War II, exhaustion was everywhere. Quilting became one of the few peaceful activities left in life. One of the most mysterious designs was the Morse code quilt. It used repeating short and long fabric pieces resembling dots and dashes. Some women intentionally stitched meaningful sequences, initials, names, or symbolic hidden messages represented through fabric placement. If you lived near a wartime factory, there was one sound you never forgot. The factory siren echoed through towns every morning. The factory siren quilt featured sharp repeating triangular patterns radiating outward like sound waves or warning alarms spreading through the air. Women working in factories often stitched these quilts. They woke before dawn, worked long, dangerous shifts, and still found time to sew. One of the most beautiful forgotten patterns from the end of WW2 was the homecoming parade quilt, reflecting relief and celebration.